Alright, good evening everyone, and welcome back. It's been a little bit longer than I would have liked since I've done one of these, mainly due to the fact that the most recent Alien Biospheres episode somehow came out being about 40 minutes long. Yeah, I have no idea how that happened. Originally I had a big long list of topics that I was going to cover, and as I was writing the script, I got through about half of them, and then I realized that I was already over 6,000 words. So I had to kind of cut my losses and work with what I already had. And because it was so long, it obviously took a lot longer than it normally would to actually put the episode together. And then, merely a few days after I actually uploaded the episode, I was beset upon by an onslaught of technical issues, which I'm still kind of dealing with currently. So if this episode comes out looking or sounding worse than it usually does, I apologize for that. In the meantime, another big, stupendous thanks to all of the patrons. And now, let us return to the Conlanging. So, in the past few days, my research has led me down some rather precipitous rabbit holes, because there were a number of topics from the last episode that came up that I wanted to investigate further, one of which was obviation. Now, I do want to learn more about obviation in general, because it seems like the more I try and learn about it, the less I understand it. For one thing, I still don't properly grasp how it interacts with the whole topic focus thing, and therefore how it would interact with the Austronesian alignment trigger system thing that we have proposed. I think maybe when I get some time, I might just sit down with a book on Plains Cree or Ojibwe or something and just try to get some sort of sense of intuition about when the obviate is and isn't used. Because right now I think my application of it would be kind of haphazard at best. And the other thing was that I did some digging into the lexical source for obviates. I'd always just kind of assumed that it was related to definiteness and deixis, because they kind of feel like they should be related, right? Because they all basically do the same thing. They're just different ways of expressing information as already introduced or known or backgrounded or something like that. But apparently, there is a cross-linguistic tendency that obviative morphology is transparently related to possessive morphology, somehow. I can't wrap my head around how that works, but apparently yes, in both Algonquin and some of the Sino-Tibetan languages that have similar sort of obviate inverse system type things, the obviate markers are phonologically very similar, or in some cases identical to the possessive markers. I can't imagine how that works or how that comes about. I'm going to have to do more research into that one. But also, when it comes to the further obviate, it seems like even in languages that do have a further obviate, it's not actually used very often, and the further obviate is almost always marked by reduplicating the standard obviate marker. So it's almost more of a kind of emphatic thing than it is an actual formal designation on the obviation scale, if that makes sense. So this thing that I proposed last time with the distinction between proximate obviate and further obviate arising from different levels of deixis, although I do like that idea, I just don't see enough evidence for it at the moment to justify that. So I'm going to scrap that idea. Instead, the proximate is unmarked. I still have no idea where the obviate comes from. I might just simplify things and just use a definite marker or a demonstrative like I did with a Lothwy. I don't know, I'll have to think about that. But then the further obviate will be whatever the obviate is reduplicated. And remember, depending on when the reduplication and when the obviation system actually comes about, it's probably not going to be a transparent reduplication because all sorts of sound changes will come along to obfuscate things. Oh, also, it looks like the further obviate is never marked on the verb. So I'm going to get rid of that. So it's just basic proximate and obviate on the verb, which I'm fine with that. Now the other topic that I've been eagerly reading up on is inverse number. Now I mentioned last time the only example of inverse number that I was familiar with is in Kiowa, and that does seem to be the most commonly cited example. But I also found a bunch of papers about a Niger-Congo language called, and I'm almost certainly going to mispronounce this, Dagare, I think. And Dagare has almost an identical system where, to put it simply, the plural suffix and the singulative suffix are phonologically identical. And nouns are divided into classes based on whether they're perceived as inherently plural or inherently singular. And also apparently there's an oceanic language called Nehan, which has, again, a very similar system. Except, of course, being an oceanic language, the plural marking is sort of wrapped up with the article that precedes the noun and not on the noun itself, which is kind of cool. And I was really curious as to how this could come about, because it doesn't seem very intuitive to me how a single marker can come to mean two completely different things depending on the noun class. But from everything that I've read, it seems that it's literally just a case of phonological reduction leading to the singular and plural marker to be pronounced identically. And then they get reanalyzed as being the same marker. Which I guess makes sense. I mean, I don't know how else it would come about. That's kind of what I suspected it would be, but I was wondering if there was any other sort of deeper magic at work. But I guess not. It's just a case of homophonous endings. And that, I think, would actually be very easy and doable to pull off, because if you look at our phonetic inventory, compared to what it was like in the Proto-Lang, you can see how many consonant distinctions we're going to lose. Particularly the palatal series. The palatal series gets completely gutted. So you can imagine if we had a plural and a singulative marker that made use of different consonants, and then those consonants got leveled so that they're pronounced the same, then suddenly our singulative and plural sound identical to each other, and voila, inverse number. But an interesting corollary to that is the fact that inverse number necessarily involves some sort of noun classification. Not necessarily full-on gender or noun classes, but nouns will need to be distinguished whether they're inherently singular or inherently plural at the very least. Now, the simplest and most obvious way to do that would just to be distinction between count and mass nouns. So count nouns would be assumed to be singular unless they were appended with a plural marker, and mass nouns would be assumed to be plural unless you added a singulative to mean like one of whatever the noun is, which is actually pretty similar to what I did in Nakachti, because in Nakachti, only animate nouns can take the plural marker, and inanimate nouns are assumed to be, well, they're treated essentially like mass nouns, but there is a separate singulative marker that can go on either animates or inanimates. And speaking of animacy, in some of those papers that I was reading about Dagare, there was big, long discussions about how nouns actually get classified, and what counts as countable and what counts as mass. And it seems that, rather unsurprisingly, animate nouns are almost always classed as countable. Which makes enough sense, because most of the time when you're dealing with something alive, it's kind of easy to, or at least with animals, it's easy to parse where one animal begins and another ends. It's a pretty discrete individual entity. Although insects usually occur pretty low down on animacy hierarchies in general, and they're more likely than other animals to get treated as mass nouns. Now this actually reminds me, there is a plurality hierarchy, I think. I can't remember who proposed it. If a language has plurality at all, then there's a sort of hierarchy as to which nouns are more or less likely to receive pluralization, which, if I can remember correctly, pronouns at the top, like Mandarin comes to mind, because pronouns are the only nouns in the entire language that demand plural marking. You can optionally mark humans for plurality, but you don't have to if you don't want to. And speaking of which, humans is next. Animals. Then I think it's specifically count nouns, then mass nouns, and then abstract nouns. I'm trying to think if it's possible to have an animate noun that's not a human or an animal. Because one thing to always keep in mind is that even though we know from a technical standpoint that plants are in fact alive and therefore can be considered animate, in the vast majority of languages, plants are considered inanimate because they don't actually move or do very much of their own accord. The only thing I can think of is weather phenomena, like wind and rain and running water and stuff. Might squeeze that in there. So essentially, the higher on this list a noun is, the more likely it is to be marked explicitly for pluralization. So I'm just trying to consider my options for a marking schema. Oh yeah, I forgot about that. I also said I'd throw in a dual as well. And have we got that in the verb? Yeah, we've got that in the verb too. So Kiowa does have a specific class of nouns that are inherently dual, and I think Dagare might as well. Like the most obvious examples of natural duals that I can think of are body parts, things like hands and feet and eyes. So if I just try and think through the marking scheme of how each of these potential classes, pronouns are obviously the most likely of all nouns to take some form of plural, so there's definitely going to be some sort of plural affix. And that sort of implies that they're the most likely to take a dual as well, so they'll have a dual too. Now obviously singular pronouns will exist, but more specifically, a singulative. Will pronouns be able to take a singulative marker? I don't think so. Does that make sense? I'm trying to think of some situation where that would be used, and nothing is coming to mind. Like maybe if you're addressing or talking with reference to a large group of people, and you wanted to say, like, one of them is my friend, and you really wanted to emphasize that it was just one? I don't know, a singulative pronoun. That seems very odd to me. I guess that's another thing to look up. For now, I'm going to leave that blank. So pronouns will definitely be unmarked for the singular, and then they'll have a distinct form for the dual and a separate form for the plural. Humans. Now I can definitely see singulatives being applied to humans. Again, as a sort of emphatic thing, like one of the people. So that will be our third marker. In fact, why am I using letters? I should use numbers. And then again, I can definitely see humans being marked with a dual, if you want two people. I've got no problem with that, so dual it is, and it's the same dual marker as the pronouns. It's probably just like an old word for two, or pair, or something like that. We could have a distinct plural ending for humans. It'll probably be the same plural as in pronouns, but I might be convinced to give humans their own plural ending. No, not the 4th of February. No. Animals. I think animals will be pretty much identical to humans in that, yes, they can take the singulative, yes, they can be marked with a dual, and the plural will probably be the same, but maybe the special one for humans. Now, this is where things get tricky. For an animate natural phenomenon, something like a river or a storm, you could say one river or one storm, that's fine. Can you say two storms, though? A pair of storms? A pair of rivers? I don't know if that would be used often enough for the dual to be associated with it. I don't know. I'm going to say the dual... no. The dual does not exist for the animate natural phenomena. And then plural? Sure. Storms, rivers, that's fine. Now, body parts is the interesting one, because body parts are the ones that are inherently, or some of them at least, are inherently dual by nature. So the dual would be unmarked then. So whereas for the animate natural phenomena, the dual form just doesn't apply, for body parts the dual form is assumed unless otherwise specified by, for example, a singulative or a plural. And now we come to the inanimates. Now, for count nouns, we would expect there to be pluralization, but there doesn't have to be. And for the dual, if we're going by this hierarchy, the dual is no longer relevant past this point. So I'm going to say no. I'm going to drag that down. No more dual. And can we apply the singulative then? This is the thing though. Because in these forms, the singulative isn't mandatory. It's only used to emphasize exactly one of something. But does that make sense for count nouns? Would they just be assumed to be singular? Well, keep in mind, this is before the syncretism of the plural and the singulative actually happens. So for now, I'm going to say yes, the singulative can occur on inanimate count nouns. And then for mass nouns, absolutely. The singulative is almost necessary. That's one of the things I love about singulatives, is you can take some undefinable quantity, or something like water, or grass, or rice, and then you can say 1 drop of water, 1 blade of grass, 1 grain of rice, and all you have to do is just add this little affix on it. It's tremendously useful. But then the plural, for a mass noun, no, that doesn't make any sense. Unless you were trying to specify groupings of whatever the mass noun is, in which case that wouldn't even be plural, that would be some other thing. And finally, abstracts. This is the easy one. No, no, and no. Generally, abstracts don't take any sort of plural marking at all because they are abstract and they're difficult to define. Even in English, we are not very likely to pluralize abstract nouns like, I don't know, intelligence or happiness or things like that. Those very rarely actually take the plural suffix. By the way, I should say, for pronouns, that's specifically first and second person pronouns, because third person pronouns are going to inflect for class, right? So potentially each of these could have its own separate pronoun, and it would obey the pluralization of whichever class it belonged to. So theoretically then, this is how things could be done in the proto-language, and then after all the sound changes, 2 and 3 will then be pronounced identically to each other. Now I think once that happens, it would be unusual for a noun to not have an unmarked state, which for humans and animals, neither of those have an unmarked state at the moment. And it only makes sense to me that the singulative would no longer apply. So do I want to keep all of these different distinctions? Because this does make sense to me as it is. I might collapse some of them together. Like, I still don't really know what to do about that human plural marker. Because whatever the human plural is, the pronoun one will match. So I'm thinking either have a separate plural just for humans, or have a separate plural for animates, which would include the natural phenomena. I'm leaning towards a separate plural for just humans, because I really want the inverse thing to come into play as much as possible. So we want a lot of 2s and just as many 3s. So I want to minimize the number of 4s, which means either 4s for humans only, or no 4s at all. I'll throw a 4 in. No, not the 4th of January. Okay, so that is a rough guide of how nouns will be appended with the inverse plural/singular marker in the modern language. But how would that have come about from the proto-language? What would the original class system have been? Well, first of all, there would probably be a fairly small number of classes, because if we look at this schema, remember all of these 2s and all of these 3s, and if each of these classes has its own distinct ending, then that's 8 different distinct markers that are now pronounced identically, which sounds like a bit of a stretch. So we can definitely say that humans have their own class, because their plural ending is unique, which means that animals would be in a separate class, or would they? Could they potentially be in the same class, just with different plurals? Maybe humans and animals belonged in the same class, and therefore originally they had the same class morphology, but then sound changes destroyed or weakened the original plural ending for both classes, and so that's when markers 2 and 4 came along and got suffixed or affixed on afterwards to clarify. In other words, the class system was around before number marking. And I could see animate natural phenomena being in the same group too. Now that I think about it, that actually might be kind of a cool conceptual metaphor, that weather events are animals. That's cool. I'm going to write that down. I hope I remember what that actually means next time I see that. Oh, also, the singulative wouldn't be mandatory on the animate natural phenomena, because the dual isn't applicable, and the only other form is the plural. So, yeah, inherent would be singular. That makes sense. Could we also include body parts in there, and then the rest would just be filed? So essentially, we could just say that the original gender system was just straight up animate and inanimate, which makes sense because we do have a separate inanimate marker in the verb template. So this class distinction could be where that originated. Or actually, maybe it does make more sense to have humans in a separate class. Okay, let me try and think through this. So way back in the day, there was a distinction between animate and inanimate nouns. And since this is a class distinction, there was some bit of class morphology attached to every noun to designate it as either animate or inanimate. So in the singular, animate nouns took affix A, and inanimate nouns took affix B. And then in the plural, either it would take the same class affix as in the singular plus some sort of default pluralization strategy, or it would take an entirely separate class affix. That would be more like the Bantu languages. And the inanimate doesn't inflect for plurality. Inanimates are just assumed to be mass nouns. Actually, hold on. Maybe it does make sense to give humans their own class. Because, let's say the human class is denoted with affix A in the singular, and then in the plural, it's affix A plus some pluralization strategy. And that affix A plus B is what results in this for suffix in the modern language. Whereas animates, non-human animates, in the singular they get affix C, but in the plural it's affix D, which is why animals and animate natural phenomena and body parts get a different plural marker. So then this to suffix either descends directly from the D suffix, which originally was just for animates, but then it got extended to count nouns by analogy, or the original D suffix was effectively destroyed by sound changes and reduced to nothingness, in which case some new marker, which became to, became incorporated. which wasn't needed for the human nouns because they've already got the a plus b thing going on. And in the dual, I'm just going to say a plus 2. It's probably going to just be 2 or pair or something similar. I can't imagine there being a separate class affix specifically for the dual, and the same for the animate. I'm imagining the dual as coming along a bit later, along with the singulative. I think the dual and the singulative will probably be more recent innovations. Essentially, they come about to remedy the fact that the original pluralization strategies were just destroyed. And inanimate, then, inanimate would take no plural marking of any kind. Now the thing is, though, in order for this system to make sense, the singular markings for these three will also need to be leveled. I'm going to do some more research into the Niger-Congo situation to try and understand better how this sort of stuff happens. But in the meantime, I'm going to call it there for now. I didn't even get to the noun cases this time. I'll have to save that for next time. But until then, thank you very much once again for watching, and I will see you next time.